Good morning and welcome to Rising. I want to wish a happy anniversary to Briahna. I saw your story on Insta and actually my own reminder too that it was 1 year ago today that you did your first guest hosting stint in that chair.
It's true. I cannot believe how time flew. Robby flew. I can't even talk to you. I'm so excited. The point is that I've been having fun. It's been a real pleasure to sit next to you.
It's great.
For a year now. I can't believe it.
It is wild how time goes. But I've been doing this for a year and a half now. I still think of it as I just took over from Crystal and Sagar. That was a long time ago.
Yeah, look, you're putting your own stamp on this. You are our elder leader here.
I don't want to hear that. Yeah, thanks a lot.
In this only, you're older than me, Robby.
All right, well, let's get into it. What do we have on deck?
Well, President Biden is contemplating sending 30 to 50 M1 Abrams tanks to Ukraine, and an announcement could come as soon as this week, according to Politico. The Biden administration had previously argued against sending the Abrams tank, saying they're too expensive and require too much maintenance. Meanwhile, Germany has confirmed it will be sending an initial shipment of 14 Leopard tanks to Ukraine. This comes after weeks of domestic and international pressure to deliver armored vehicles aimed at helping Kyiv regain territory seized by Russia, the New York Times reports.
Russia has responded to the tank shipments as a blatant provocation. These developments come just after several senior Ukrainian officials, including the deputy defense minister, resigned amid a crackdown on corruption in the country. Those officials are accused of bribery and leading luxurious lives in wartime. A senior aide said President Volodymyr Zelensky is responding to a key public demand that justice should apply to everyone. So we have potentially more weapons, courtesy of the U.S. taxpayers, arriving in a war zone. There are many reasonable concerns about this, I think. Will they just end up prolonging the war is one. Again, we need to wrap this up. We need to end this. Two, we have to worry about weapons falling into the wrong hands or just hands we don't know who ends up with it. All this stuff, not all of it gets blown up. Some of it stays around. And we had this experience in the Middle East where we armed people we were temporarily aligned with, and then we're so surprised when they're shooting at us with our own guns or launching our own rockets at us because circumstances changed. And the Pentagon is terrible at accounting for this stuff. It loses track of billions of dollars in the Middle East.
Yeah, what was the CBS story that was taken down because it was tracking the enormous sums of money that and support, arms support that were not trackable, were not traceable to Ukraine, and this inconvenient truth meant that they had to pull their story from their website when they got pushed back, not because it was wrong again, but just because it was an inconvenient truth. Look, I think that's a perfectly legitimate concern. It's also concerning to me that the conversation about increasing funding, military support, military aid isn't connected in any way to a conversation about what military goals they hope to achieve that would facilitate an end to the conflict. So how it's paired with the negotiations that I hope are still ongoing, but which we hear very little about. So what's the idea that if we are able to reclaim this amount of territory, Ukraine is going to be able to bargain in this way that it can't bargain today or negotiate today?
That's such a great point.
There's no connection between how long we are going to fight or what the actual territorial goals are or military goals are of the Ukrainians to what the final resolution of this conflict are going to be. And if that were the case, and if that were more explicit, I think some people who are, rightly concerned about how much money is being spent over there, while Americans are suffering paying more than an hour minimum wage salary on a carton of eggs, perhaps would be more okay.
That's such a good point. And we just had Davos with a lot of discussion of Ukraine, a lot of open-ended commitment to whatever Zelensky wants. They didn't gather and say, okay, this is going to be the last shipment of stuff, and these are the war objectives, and then we're going to press for meetings on this timetable. They don't even say that. They don't even say that and then fail to deliver on that promise. It's amazing that they don't even try to delude people into thinking that the situation is under control. They just say, no, we're just going to, as much money, many weapons as it takes for as long as it takes. Right. That's just the reality.
Right.
It's brazen. It's brazen.
And the U.S. is basically saying so many, senior officials have just said out loud, this is about weakening Russia at this point, right? And it's interesting to contrast that rhetoric with rhetoric about Putin and the argument that, oh, well, he's never going to stop. Nothing will satisfy him. He wants to reconstitute the Russian Empire and conquer half of Europe. I mean, these are the kind of things that people say to justify U.S. support. Well, Putin isn't actually saying that he wants to conquer all of Europe. The West is saying they want to do this to weaken Russia. And I do think there's a way that reining in that language and people being more honest and explicit about what their goals are and having those goals be less than weakening Russia, right? Being actually connected to helping Ukraine get to peace, get their citizenry out of harm's way, establish borders, settle this conflict would help the settlement negotiations. But I don't see how you can sit here and say we can't stop the war because Putin's operating in bad faith and just wants to conquer all of Europe. Well, what we see from the West is these explicit statements that say, well, we don't want to settle the war either. We just want to weaken Russia.
And at what point does an open-ended, no end in sight commitment to weakening Russia and harming the Putin regime just become war? When they describe Russia's describing the tanks as a provocation. I was reading about American entry into World War I the other day because the Lusitania was a Jeopardy answer. I watch Jeopardy every day. And the ship that was sunk by German U-boats that understandably outraged Americans. The ship, though, it was in a war zone. It was headed to Britain, and actually in the advertisements on the New York Times, like right next to book your ticket today on the Lusitania, the German ambassadors had run a ton of ads right next to it saying, don't get on this boat. We're going to freaking sink it. It's in a war zone. But that drew us in inevitably to this conflict because we were trying to carry on oh yeah, we're still, and there were weapons on that ship for British forces. And it became, and eventually we ended up joining World War I, getting sucked into this by, trying to have kind of a middle ground, but we were supplying our friends and et cetera. And then it became World War I.
Yeah.
And that is something we have to avoid in this scenario in which the countries have nuclear weapons has to be avoided at all costs. Well, and they don't understand the at all cost part of that.
Speaking of that.
Speaking of that, right. Tell us about the Doomsday Clock.
Speaking of the end of the world, a panel of international scientists has warned that humanity's existence is at greater risk than ever, especially as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The Guardian reports the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists set its doomsday clock at 90 seconds to midnight, the closest to midnight the clock has been since it was established in 1947 to illustrate global existential threats at the dawn of the nuclear weapons age.
Rachel Bronson, the president of the Bulletin, said the clock had been moved forward from 100 seconds to midnight, where it had been for the previous 3 years, quote, largely, though not exclusively, because of the mounting dangers of the war in the Ukraine. I actually have a bone to pick with this thing. I think the Doomsday Clock is the stupidest thing.
Why is that, Robby?
Because it's utterly unscientific. Now, in this narrow case, moving it closer because of the threat of nuclear war because of Russia is perhaps a proper use of the actual thing, but that was its intention. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought us closer to the brink than anything else. But they adjust it. They adjust it for climate change. They adjust it they're always adjusting it in a kind of we're always closer to nuclear annihilation than, no, we were pretty close during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then there was a long period of not being very close at all. There's nothing scientific about it. It's just a gimmick. It's a gimmick.
So, is the issue that there's no, precise measurement for how exogenic crisis is and how many seconds get ticked?
Yes.
Or that there are things that are included in it, like climate change, that aren't about the risk of nuclear conflict?
But both. Mostly the former. They have no precise measurements for that. They have no precise measurements for it. It's just a PR stunt. It's just pay attention to us kind of thing. It's so stupid. Well,
I don't know that anyone thinks of it as, science per se. Nobody's setting their clock by the Doomsday Clock.
With such a solemn kind of, we've moved it. Oh yeah,
but isn't that the effect
it doesn't reflect the actual
have?
Danger of extinction to humanity in most cases.
Isn't the point, and why we're talking about it, that it is a more easy to understand metric of what the risk level is in the United States of America? I mean, George Bush
doesn't correspond to any risk
George
level.
Bush had his color system, right? His do you remember that? He had a rainbow chart of how dangerous things were going in America.
But that was widely mocked, and instead this is treated with very serious.
Yeah. I mean, I think they were both designed to heighten fear. And if you believe that the fear that Bush was trying to stoke was in bad faith, then you would mock it. If you think that the fear of nuclear threat or environmental threat is real, then you would appreciate this. Also, this is something that's kind of obviously an optics gag, whereas George Bush was president of the United States of America and it was driving policy in a more direct way. But still, like I think the underlying goals are the same. And I think you agree, we should be afraid. Very, very afraid, regardless of whether or not you think that this particular clock is a good metric of precisely where we are.
I think we should be a little afraid right now, absolutely, but I don't think these people are to be taken seriously. Just put it all the way.
All right.
We'll see it.
Robby
see
says ratchet it up to 1 second to midnight and see if that kicks us in the tuchus. We'll continue to follow the story as it develops. Still coming up on Rising today, Marianne Williamson joins to discuss Speaker of the House Kevin McCarthy's subcommittee on the weaponization of the federal government. Plus, a former top FBI official in New York has been arrested over his ties to a Russian oligarch. Stay tuned for all of that, as well as My Radar, coming up next.